Good afternoon, everyone. I know I'm the one thing standing between you guys and some kick-ass cocktails, which I cannot partake in, so I'm very jealous. But thank you all for being here this afternoon. My name is Simone Petrella. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberVista. We are a training and workforce development company. By way of background on myself, and I will use this because I think the story is important, I actually came out of the cybersecurity industry, not academia, not training development or anything like that. I spent my time, 12 years, both with the Department of Defense as well as on the defense contracting side, and worked in cyber threat intelligence for the entirety of that time. And what I think is really important about that story is I learned a few lessons in both being part of the intelligence community, working and building out teams that had to serve the intelligence community, and then later working with the commercial sector, primarily in financial and retail customers, in building out their security operations as they started to really build out their cybersecurity programs. And the lesson I learned, because cyber threat intelligence is different than other domains of cybersecurity, and we'll talk about that a little bit further as we talk about the industry and the talent problem writ large, but I learned a lesson very early on, which was I had a 0% success rate in taking a hyper-technical person and making them a threat analyst, at least in the context of where I worked and the clients I supported. 0%. I failed every time. And I have some colleagues and friends, and they'll say, well, I had like one person that really was able to kind of do both, but it never worked. And as I started to get out, and I'm one of the co-founders of CyberVista, is we started to talk about this talent problem. What we really quickly discovered, which validated a lot of my personal experience, and I know a lot of colleagues I have, is that sometimes we're looking for talent in all the wrong places, and we as an industry are probably doing a disservice to ourselves by pigeonholing in the way that we train, educate, and upskill our future cybersecurity workforce. And how could we have not done that? Because we haven't actually really defined what the field is yet. It's constantly evolving. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about kind of what the landscape is today, and some interesting or unique ways that both as an employer, but as well as an individual, we can start thinking about this model differently. So first, let's talk about the landscape as it is today. I'm going to be honest, I stopped pulling logos because I got really tired. So there are a lot more than that, but if a lot of those are familiar, there's probably a lot left out. Again, my cut and paste skills, I started to get really, really exhausted. But I think you understand the overall point. This market, this industry, when we talk about how we look at the cybersecurity talent landscape and how we pipeline people, it's crowded. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of confusion, and it's extremely fragmented. Where do you go? And just so we can get past the logos and get into some of the numbers, I looked at some of this on the back end for us for this discussion. There are over 260 universities currently. They're accredited by the NSA alone to teach cyber defensive skills or cybersecurity defensive programs. There are about 150 universities that do the same thing but for cyber offensive skills. Then there are, and it might actually be 86, there are 85 different types of credentials and certifications you could potentially try and pursue and get next to your name that have some relation to security. Does anyone have 85 certifications? Should I work backwards? 26? I've seen someone with 26. Well, as you can tell, that's a lot. I actually tried to look into this, and I would love to know if someone has found or has a sense on the answer. I cannot think of one other profession, and I've been in this space for 15 years, that has this many credentials associated with one profession. Like how in the world, and hell, if we go get all these credentials, we're not doing any work. So there goes our security problems. But so what does that mean? Like, what's the impact of that fragmented environment we've got? Well, it really boils down to two problems. It's a problem for the employers, the people that are looking to hire this talent and secure our critical infrastructure, secure our financial sector, secure their companies. And it's a problem for the individuals, those of us that are on the practitioner side that are trying to actually progress and grow in the field and help solve these problems. Well, I want to dive into that for a minute. Why is it a problem for the employers? Well, one of the most common things I hear is, one, I can't identify talent. It's really hard to get someone hired. The average time I have open on a requisition for a cybersecurity professional is 3 to 6 months if I am lucky. Then I hear, well, we can't really, we have some really great, bright minds and they're talented, but we can't get them up to speed enough for the jobs I need them to perform. They know some theoretical knowledge or they've had some experience on certain tools, but they're not specifically performance ready for what I need in my organization. And then lastly, once you get them to that point, if you're lucky enough, then you have to keep them. And once they're trained up and maybe you've done some on the job, maybe you've sent them to some great training courses, well, I know I had this happen to me many, many times where someone would walk into my office and say, thank you so much for the opportunity of the last 2 years. I have learned so much. I'm going to go work at SAIC for 30% more. And I'd be like, that's great, because I can't pay you 30% more. So please keep in touch. And so, retention becomes a really big issue. But what's interesting is when you look at just even let's take the identification of talent at the very top end of this as an example. Well, what I hear from employers all the time, and I experienced as an employer all the time, was a lot of the candidates that I reviewed and tried to screen were extremely overqualified on paper. But when you started to get them in the actual job, they didn't have the ability to demonstrate the actual skills. So there was a massive disconnect. So that's time, that's money, that's lots of things for me on the employer side. Well, the reverse is true for the individual and the candidates, because now that I'm on this side of the world, we talk to people who are eager to break into the field, who are looking to progress into the field, and they tell me the same thing. They say, I went out and I got all these qualifications, I got all of these credentials, but I'm not getting callbacks for interviews because I have the credential, but somehow that's not necessarily resonating on what the employer is looking for. Oh, and by the way, it's really expensive. If you were to add up how much time it takes to pair the time and cost of taking an exam or multiple exams, a university degree, an associate's degree, a master's degree, whatever program you potentially choose, that adds up. So it's really difficult to kind of focus what their efforts are going to be on. And oh, by the way, do they, in every case, does everyone know exactly what role they want to go into in cybersecurity? We call cybersecurity this massive umbrella term, but when you ask someone, are you interested in pen testing? Or is vulnerability management as a broader kind of triaging issue more important to you? Or are you interested in threat intel? Or how about incident response? We haven't done a good job of defining how those roles fit within the structure of the discipline of cybersecurity, and then giving them a path to potentially get there. So if I've beaten that dead horse, I'll talk to you later. I can beat it again. Oh, and I don't know how to use PowerPoint. Bear with me. There we go. All right, so what I want everyone in this room to start thinking about, this is something I have spent a lot of time thinking about, is how do we change this? How do we start to evolve to a new model about how we think about our own industry? And I want to think about it in terms of a career model. And I want to think about it in terms of a career model because, as I just said, we don't really have a great way to define this multidisciplined industry we're calling cybersecurity today. When I first started, it was information assurance and electronic warfare, and then we said, well, we'll call it cyber in 2007, and no one actually, it took 2 years for the DoD to even decide what they were going to call cybersecurity. And then it turns out the Army, Navy, and Air Force and Marines all had different definitions. But what's important about having the career model is in order to do this, in order to successfully get to this evolution, there's a lot of front-end work we have to do first on what are the roles we actually expect when we talk about how we secure our businesses, our organizations, our governments. And then if we know what the roles are, what are the expectations of what people need to do in those roles? What skills do they actually need to know? what do they need to perform and at what level? Because you know what? If I am an incident responder, I'm going to need to know how to take my flyaway kit and break that open on someone's box and maybe potentially do some forensics for discovery or something else. But if I'm looking at an ancillary field where I need to know what incident response does, but really I'm in charge of patching every day, it's kind of like the IT little IR functions, you might not need to do it, but you need to understand it. Those are different levels of knowledge and ability to both demonstrate and know things. And we haven't done that. We haven't done that work on the front end. So I want to think about how we can actually evolve to that model, because from there, for someone like me, who is now part of a training and education company, but you think about universities, you think about employers who are developing internal programs, the best way for us to build out training is by listening to what the employers need or what the organizations need and react to that, not the other way around. So, how do we get there? First of all, I mentioned that we've taken a really skills-based approach to this entire model. So one of the first things you have to do is understand, what does the employer care about? Again, that employer can be the government, the employer can be a private organization, it can be a nonprofit, it could be a healthcare system. Every sector is dealing with a cybersecurity issue in some factor. The only difference is how many resources they have to apply to it. So some organizations have thousands of cybersecurity professionals, and some have 10, and some have 1, and some have 0. Many have 0. So when we think about understanding those roles, it's not just, hey, here's a cookie cutter model, and here's a bunch of roles, and let's kind of define skills. We have to think about in the context of some organizations are going to have very discrete roles where you do one very specific task, and others are going to say, I need someone who is broader in their knowledge but can apply it across the board. But how do you do that? So we wanted to start by developing a framework. We said you can't do anything unless you actually have a working map of how you actually build out those skills. And again, this matters to me because I want to build training programs. We want to actually address those gaps once we identify them. But it turns out a framework doesn't exist that say, here are these massive gaps already, so you have to kind of work backwards and do all that work yourselves. But what that does allow you, if you can accomplish that, is to create a standard that is flexible enough to allow people to build on top of and actually kind of start to think about how do you train these people when you identify the skills they need. So it comes down to, what are the skills that actually baseline someone as a cyber professional versus when they start to specialize in a particular area. And this is important for individuals because they often don't know the starting point. And it's important for employers because they often don't kind of spend the time to recognize, what are the barriers to entry? What are the first things that someone needs to know in order to just get into this industry writ large, right? Do they need to know networking? Yes, you need to know networking. So if you don't know networking, you're probably not going to get your foot in the door in anything security related. But as you start to then get those barriers to entry checked off, now we can start talking about what are the distinctions in different roles and how do you actually think about what kind of framework you can put in place to help individuals navigate those roles, as well as create training plans that are a little bit more efficient because, this is, I hear all the time that this is a constantly evolving, changing, high innovative field, which is actually kind of funny because when you think about it, it's not that, I don't want to sit here and say we're not an innovative bunch. I think we're a very innovative bunch. But I do think that there is a conflation of this being an industry where the baseline knowledge and conceptual things that one needs to know doesn't change that frequently. But we conflate it with the idea that the tools, the technology, and the techniques we're using to apply those concepts are what's changing very rapidly. And so because we've conflated those two things, we sometimes have a tendency to not focus on the actual kind of core knowledge. We'll go straight to the tool. Well, then that tool gets, sunsetted by another tool, and then all of a sudden we want someone who knows a particular SIM technology and how to write in that language, and then we think about, well, if we appraise it, we paid them this much for this, now I've moved on to the next one, and they don't have it. Instead of kind of the teaching people how to fish. I'll use the analogy, individuals in like the medical field. We train surgeons how to be surgeons, and there are new techniques that are coming up every single year that they're applying, or they're using more robotics to perform some of those programs. We don't stop teaching them the baselines of what their surgery knowledge requires. We just have to then train them up on a new tool. So, soapbox, speech over. So I want to walk you through a little bit about how we approach the problem, and I really would love to hear some of your thoughts as we near the end of this. But we wanted to sort of start out by talking to some major employers. We wanted to talk to major employers that span a number of industries as well as a number of sizes. And the reason we wanted to do that is we wanted to understand what are the roles that typically are found in those companies, what are the expectations, or how do they define those roles, because even in a SOC, what a tier 3 analyst is in one organization it's usually very similar, but there's often some very interesting differences between one organization and another. So we wanted to understand those and see where the overlaps were as well as where the differentiations were. And then we wanted to actually validate those roles and start to break them down into what are the common skills that we see in all those areas of overlap, and how do we start to consolidate that into some kind of common framework or lexicon that we can work with. And so that's exactly what we did. We said, all right, we have a sense of the roles now. We have been given information and data across a number of employers, not only by the role, but also by how do they think about the leveling of that role? How do they think about the tracking of that role? Because there are differences between someone who becomes a specialist versus someone who becomes a manager, or potentially more on a leadership track, and the expectations are different. And how do they think about, what are the ultimate, levels as far as how they define when someone needs to know something, when they need to do it, and when they have to have it mastered. So once we had a good working prototype, and really even before we got to prototype, we had a working definition of what these common roles were, actually going out and talking to the workforce, we then said, well, we can come up with a prototype that actually maps some of these jobs, these common jobs, to skills. And what are the skills that are generally required? Either that they have to perform, they need to know, or they need to master. From there, we have to start talking about what does it mean to have a skill? What's the content behind that? So this is where I would have to bring in my team of learning and instructional design wonks who can, I guess we go off on like tangents and really weird directions, but man, if you spend enough time with instructional designers and curriculum developers in a room, we would all glaze over. Maybe you guys would find it interesting. I commonly had no idea what they were talking about. But what we were able to do is actually say, what are the common domain areas that are, again, those barriers to entries or that we see across all these job roles that were being requested? And once you define what those common domain areas are, then how do you actually build out a whole taxonomy that goes from like domain to subject and topic, and then the level, and then the learning objective, and it's a big mess, and it looks really ugly, but it was kind of awesome. And I'll show you why. So, on the left, it is meant to be an eye chart. It unfortunately just doesn't fit on any slide in any kind of way. That is literally what the mapping of a taxonomy ended up looking like for one domain. So there's 7 more of these. And I call this out to say, A, here are the domains that we defined. You can nitpick and we can talk semantics on the names of the domains. But we broke it down into governance, networking, risk, security engineering, the software and hardware, as well as threats and vulnerabilities. Pretty broad, right? So when you define something that broadly, you can see how it starts to need to kind of like really build out to the right depending on what level you need to know, how much you need to know, what's the actual subcomponents of each of those domains. I want to call out two things. One, I'd mentioned before, the thing that changes the most often in our field are the tools, tactics, techniques, and technology. And so we didn't want to leave that out as a domain, but turns out all those things relate to all the other domains. They cross-cut. So we've already made an intentional decision to make that a functional overlay, because the tools are going to be different depending on which other domain you apply it to. You know, there are very sophisticated tools that exist for, you know, GRC, like governance, risk, and compliance people, and you have to have knowledge of them, but you're not going to certainly want to kind of dive into GRC tools if you're talking about threats and vulnerabilities. The second thing I want to point out in a caveat, but we acknowledged it, was the need for soft skills. One of the most commonly requested and surveyed responses when you talk to employers about what they want from their cybersecurity and information security workforce are communication, ability to convey information to an executive audience, and understand the business impact of their role and what they're doing on a daily basis. I'd like to sit here and say that we have some great solution for that. I'm actually terrified of how to teach anyone a soft skill if you don't have it. Again, I point back to my 0% success rate with some of my, you know, trying to turn people into threat analysts. But I do think that there are some common, especially as you get into kind of like leadership domains, there's some very, very good things that you can talk about when it comes to business impact, understanding how it relates to the broader parts of the business that, frankly, and maybe controversially, given that we're sitting in an institution of higher learning, you know, I think universities have maybe missed the boat a little bit on, because we have created all these cybersecurity degrees because it's the hot thing and there's lots of money in it, but we kind of left off the whole like well-rounded education and maybe some other components at the same time. So hopefully no one retracts my degrees. But so here's where it was cool. This is what was exciting about all that wonky taxonomy work, was it gave us a starting point to start to look at individual roles and identify gaps. Because we had our first working list of what is an actual skill required. And then from there, you could start to look at, well, if someone's starting as an entry-level cybersecurity technician, and maybe they want to progress to a mid-level, or maybe they want to become advanced, but maybe they're also new and they don't understand the sort of like, you know, the industry or the landscape enough to even know what they're interested in doing. And so actually they kind of want to explore pen testing because it seemed like a really great place to get into, but they just didn't have the ability to start there. Well, it turns out just because you start in point A doesn't mean you lose all that knowledge when you start to think about how do I upskill or how do I transition. You actually carry that with you, and it's really valuable experience, it's really valuable education. So once you have that baseline map from all that ugly work we did, you can actually start to say, well, what are the areas that you would need to fill in order to transition from one role to another, or from one level at one role into the next level of that role. So here's just an example and a snapshot of a few roles. It got really messy if you kind of built them all out. So why was this kind of exciting to us? As you saw in the previous slide, we originally based this off the NIST Cybersecurity Workforce Framework, which is an incredible framework. It is a good first attempt at kind of creating a federal government-wide lexicon for how we define cybersecurity workforce. Anyone want to guess at what the problem is with the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework? Does anyone work in an organization that has over 64 job roles? Just for cyber. Do you work for the government? Yes, okay, so that's the only organization that has 64 job roles in cybersecurity. I have not gone to, I mean, we have talked to organizations that have thousands of cybersecurity professionals in the private sector. The most I've had is 15. So if you don't work for the government, no one can sit there and be like, well, here are my 64 roles. A lot of people are saying, I don't have 64 staff. So, you know, this is not going to help. And then on top of it, we're going to give you these 64 roles and thousands of KSAs associated with each of those roles to try and sift through. So it also became extremely difficult to use. Like, how does anyone use that thing? So what we really aimed to do once we had this map and we said, look at the cool things we can do on gap analysis and how to start to think about it, we said, you could create a pathway. You could create a really flexible pathway because the role definitions might change. The government might have a cyber threat intel analyst, and that means something very specific, but then PNC Bank, they have a whole cyber threat intelligence team, and that means a whole cadre of other things because they include threat hunting, and they include the tactical and the strategic. And so, but if you have all your skills laid out already, it's like the Chinese menu to end all Chinese menus. Like, you get to pick and choose. So we said, that would be really cool because we can do that. You define that role, and all of a sudden you have a nice, clean mapping, a framework to start from, where you look at your own organization and say, what are the roles? What levels do I generally see those roles kind of fall into? And how do those roles start to branch as they become more technically specialized, or maybe they become more policy-focused and general management focused? And so what are the differences of the things I would need between the two? And so that kind of led us to a great start of a map. And by the way, I said I was a training company. Like, again, we have done all this background work because how do you build something? How do we collectively solve this problem if we don't start with kind of this source, right? So this is almost like the precursor to trying to actually solve the problem. So here's an example of how that kind of plays out as we kind of look through it. Now, this may look very similar to an organization you work or have worked for. It might look very different. That's okay. This is only meant to be an example. This is not meant to be the definitive map of cybersecurity job roles. The point is that if you were to try and dive into any single one of those circles, the key is, what are the competencies? What are the skills that you're looking for in each of the roles as you and your organization define them? Right? It starts with you as the employer, or you as the person that owns the job role. What do you need to do in that job? And then from there, you can identify the skills that you would expect someone to have, what they need to know, what they need to do, what they need to master. And then from there, you can kind of create a map that looks very similar to this. You might have only 4 roles, and those roles are really wide. And so then you have to be able to say, you know what? I'm okay if I have 10 people in my organization that know a little bit about a lot, because that's the best I can do right now. I want to get to the point that I am more robust and we're spending more resources, but we're not there yet. That's okay. The point is, you have a path. So in this example, in this organization, it's clearly a slightly larger organization because they have a number of roles. But in this example, we have a technician who's saying, you know what? I want to move to the next level, but I really wanted to sort of think about going from what's the equivalent of kind of like an entry-level SOC analyst into a more kind of, cybersecurity analyst role. And so what do the gaps look like? The skills you see on that pop-out are, again, it's the gaps. It's not that you just leave everything you had behind you. It would look totally different if we started with someone who had been an incident responder, because they started with a different set of skill sets. Now, we'll talk about in a second, how do you use this? How do you action it? Because the reality is, none of us come in with the exact same cookie cutter set of experiences and strengths and weaknesses. We all have different ones. So you have to start thinking about from here how that actually applies when you're talking about giving someone a training plan or getting them up to speed. So that's where I kind of want to leave you with this, because that's where it comes down to, how do you action on that? Because it's not a cookie cutter model. And right now, the way we tend to do education, and this is not a criticism of cybersecurity, I think it's just the way we do education in the US, is we tend to kind of say, here's the curriculum, go through it in this order, here are the things you need to learn, and on your way. But the reality is that depending on where you're starting from, or what your skills were, or maybe you were coming out of an IT role, so you have a really strong baseline knowledge in kind of, whether it's networking or anything like that, you're starting at a different place than someone else. That's true of the individual, and it's true of the employer. So the reason that that's important is because when you think about how do we then create efficiencies and be more productive and more effective, you got to kind of know those starting points. So for us, it's about, maybe assessment is sometimes a hot button word because people think it's tied to their comp. I've gotten a lot of responses being like, no, don't assess me. They'll not dock my pay. So no, okay, fine, don't dock your pay. But you want to diagnose what your starting point is, right? You get blood work every year because you want to know, here's my baseline. The cholesterol's a little high, let me work on that. Or, hey, I'm kind of good on vitamin D this year, but next year it's a little low, so I should work on that. Same thing in our knowledge areas. So if you can start on what the skills are required in each role and say, here's what we generally think someone needs to know in their current role, you can do kind of the equivalent of a diagnostic and understand, okay, you have some strengths, you have some weaknesses, it's probably not that efficient for you, it's definitely not that efficient for your employer to spend a ton of time or money or lost productivity sending you to a training class on stuff you already know. But it certainly would be beneficial for you, and it certainly would be beneficial for your employer to send you to something that actually focuses on the things that you need to know, but you just don't know or you're not as strong in. And then from there you can start to then build and scaffold the actual training programs that exist. And I keep mentioning this idea of what do you need to know, what do you need to do, and what do you need to master? And that's where I think it becomes really important to understand everything is linked. We see a lot of connections between the concepts, and there's a lot of really great material and assets out there that teach the concepts, but they fall short because they don't tie it to the real world situation of the role. So how do you tie that back to the role that someone needs to know? And once you give them that knowledge and once they have that foundation, how do you start to dive deeper depending on the level of maturity they need to demonstrate in that role? If you are in a position where you need to actually be able to use Wireshark, open it, analyze a packet, get the readouts, that is a very, very different learning set of objectives than if you're just, I kind of need to know what a packet is and why it matters. So, that's where it comes into the reinforcement. You can't just teach someone the learning because then they're not able to do it. But you also can't just teach them to do one thing because they don't have the baseline knowledge, like I said in my surgeon example, to apply it when the next tool or technology comes along. So you need both. And that's where it gets really exciting for someone like me. Because if I know those parameters, I can build stuff off that. We can connect those dots. And so what I want to leave you all with today is there actually isn't one solution to this problem. And I'm not up here today telling you that I have the solution, because I don't. I am one piece of this solution, but everyone in this room is one piece of that solution. And so when we think about where we started and how we define this industry, it is up to the individuals who are looking to break into the industry to demand and ask, what are the expectations? What do you need of me for me to be successful in this role? It's up to us in this room that are the employers, the hiring managers, the folks that try and identify, train, and keep these people, to think a little bit more strategically about what is it that we're looking for, what do we need? Because maybe there are untapped sources of talent that we're not thinking about. I actually learned very early on, leading threat intel teams, that I had a lot of success, out of all things, hiring former attorneys or recovering attorneys. And the reason I had success hiring attorneys was not because I wanted their legal counsel or their debate skills. Kind of had to take that with the territory. And it took a long time. There was a lot of bad conversations in there. But what they could do is they knew how to write in what was like an intelligence community-like assessment. They knew how to come to a conclusion, state it up front, and then back it up with really clear evidence. But you know what? I didn't just want to find any attorney. I wanted to find those who were like, I like technology. I'm interested in it. I have a passion to learn this. And I could go and I could teach them those skills. I could send them to classes where they could learn those things. They were open to it. They were smart people, and they could absorb it. And that was really exciting to me because it was a whole untapped source of potential talent that's not coming out with just like a cookie cutter degree. So there's just more of them. And they kind of thought it was exciting because they were breaking into this hot new field that everyone thought was, you know, the new sexy cybersecurity field. So I think it's really important to think about how we as employers and hiring managers contribute to this as well. And then, you know, lastly, organizationally, as we think about our broader organizations we work for, what impact, how do we start to really emphasize the importance of focusing on like the aspects of this work that is not defined today? Because it's not going to be solved by only cybersecurity professionals in the room. It's going to need some HR professionals because it often gets tied to comp. It's going to need the actual CISOs and their teams to think about why do I care about workforce and why do I want to push this as an initiative? And really only then can we start to really define the space and push it down to the people like me, the people like the universities, the higher education institutions, the bachelor's degrees, the associate's degrees, the 85 certifications that start to think about how do we test, how do we train so that we actually are meeting this big demand. So with that, I'm leaving you all with a call to action to sort of take this to heart. But in the interim, I would love to know if any of you have any questions. And I just want to pause and catch my breath. Yes?
You identified early on all of the certifications in the market today. Do you think that they may be providing some of the coverage you're talking about because they have different applications, CISSP, fraud management, vendor specialties, AppSec, auditing? I mean, are they already covering this to some degree?
They do, and to some degree they absolutely do. And it really depends because you have to almost break the certifications down into their sub-segments. Because, you know, looking at like a CISSP or even a CISM, which is very managerial focused, is very different than saying, hey, I'm, you know, Cisco certified on these set of routers, which is obviously very tactical. I would say one of the biggest things that we found as we looked at the certifications, and I have to be honest, I couldn't look at all 85 because you also start to glaze over and fall asleep then too. But what's incredible about it is the amount of overlap that occurs in like those certifications and the content. And so the content is surprisingly similar. It's just the perspective or blush that gets put over the top that tends to vary. So I think you definitely have to separate the like tactical application focused specific certifications because you're going to operate on a certain firewall, you're going to operate on a certain router, from the broader kind of professional certifications where, you know, the difference between a Security Plus and Certified Ethical Hacker and a CISP and a CISM is often a matter of degrees of, do you need to actually know the rote content or do you need to somehow apply it in some kind of cost-benefit manager situation? So it's definitely a step in the right direction, but it's a lot because we can't even tell people when they need to go for the specialization versus when they would benefit from having one of the broader ones. Yes?
So the representation of women and minorities in this field is disproportionate. Has your organization looked at anything about training that might make the training attract a more representative sample of society?
As long as you're not asking me that as a token woman up here, yes. I'm kidding. No, so, you know, I think one of the reasons that we as an organization were really passionate about it, but myself in particular, is I have spent my entire career in the cybersecurity and DoD sector where I have always been one of the very few women in the room, one of the only, you know, and then when you look at like other demographic groups, the minorities get even worse and smaller. And that's been something that has really driven a lot of what we've focused on. And part of the underlying premise when we started down this path was the idea of, again, like alternative sources of talent. And that's not just, hey, are you a lawyer? It's the experience, but it's also the background, the type of people you can access, and the kind of things they bring to the table. Because even when I look at, you know, my own perspective or the meetings I'm in, if we all come with the same exact perspective because we came in with the same kind of experiences and background and biases, we're not doing ourselves any favor. We're all thinking about security in the exact same way. And these other, you know, there are other unrepresented or underrepresented groups that really could bring a valuable perspective, and they're just not seeing a way to break into the field. So training can be instrumental in helping to solve that. because you just need to give someone the opportunity and the pathway. But then it's on us on the other side of the fence as the employers to say, well, how do I think about how I want to find these people differently? Because we're not doing that yet, right? So training's one half of it, but then it's kind of on the employer side the other. But thank you. I love that question. Yes?
How do you, so what's your approach for to identify a gap? Like, what's the approach to getting someone to get to that training? And then, so how do you figure out from that perspective whether or not, the training perspective, whether that's going to be equal across these different sectors or whomever is going to be teaching the training? Because you want to have some kind of standard.
Yep.
You can't just say, well, you need this specific thing.
Yeah, that's part of the reason it's so important from my perspective to start with the job role and the expectations first. Because if you don't know what the expectation is and at what level of performance, then it doesn't even matter. You can't identify a gap because there's not one to be found. So if you start with that, and that's where it really becomes, I put the onus on the employers to say, you gotta be able to define what your expectations are. Once you do that, it becomes very easy because we can say, okay, here are the expectations, here's the skills, here's the level of performance that they need to operate on in each of those levels. So the way you identify the gap once you've done all that work is you say, I give you the equivalent of that diagnostic. And let's say in your case, you need to know a concept of a particular skill, but you don't need to apply it. Well, maybe then it's just checking your knowledge. But if there's another area within your role that requires you to actually demonstrate a competency, then part of that diagnostic becomes, how are you performing in a simulated environment? How are you actually performing a task? You can score that, and you can weight that depending on kind of the job functions and roles. And once you have that scoring, you can say, hey, overall, you were 75% there. You did well overall. But then as you start to dive into each of those areas, we see, you were sort of weak as you were looking at asset control or identity and access management or something like that. And then we say, well, that's actually a pretty strong area that we need from the role perspective. Let's dive into then what training focuses on that area that you just did not do as well in, compared to the rest of the role. And I say all this saying this is kind of, concept for the future. There is not an off-the-shelf thing that exists that does this today. Man, I'm trying real hard to build it fast, but it only goes so far. But it really does start with being able to set the expectations of what is needed first. Then once you start assessing and doing diagnostics, then you can start pointing people to either training that already exists because, hey, turns out there's some really amazing assets and quality things that we can send people to today, or we can start demanding that people build it. Yes?
Do you think then as technical people that we should go out and practice our speech writing? Because you said that lawyers come in with strong soft skills, so should we develop our soft skills and maybe go take classes and debate or something?
Oh yeah, hey, I'm all for developing soft skills. I was not trying to say that we shouldn't develop soft skills. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned. Again, I go back to the communication, especially when you're talking about security programs in private companies. The biggest challenge is, our existence rests like everyone else's on our ability to make a compelling argument for why we should exist, why we should be funded, and why we're actually having an impact on the business. And we're already starting off in a really tough spot because you're always a cost center. If anyone in this room has actually been able to successfully tie revenue generation to their cybersecurity function, please let me know. I would love to talk to you.
I frame it as cost avoidance.
Well, right, but have you calculated that? So close. But so, when it comes to making that business case on cost avoidance, but without having numbers you can attach to it, it's really important to be able to clearly and concisely communicate what that is. That means that we have to spend the time not only learning how to be compelling and, constructive in how we actually make those asks and those requests, but it's also about understanding, hey, maybe we should spend a little bit of time learning about the business I'm operating in. What's my industry? Why does my industry care? Why does my company care? What's the leadership's priorities? I'll go back to my lawyer analogy. The first thing they tell you is, as a lawyer, you never want to get into a courtroom and not have a sense of the judge that you're going to be presenting your case in front of. You got to know your audience. that's kind of soft skills. Like, you've got to spend the time knowing your audience. And there are lots of great resources out there to start to hone those things, whether it's the communication aspects of it, whether it's the research you can do in advance, or whether it's maybe not speech writing. I don't know if that would help you very much. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Toastmasters. Yeah, but I absolutely think that you can't have a conversation about this without kind of, sharpening that saw. Any other questions? Yes.
So I've got a question for you. First of all, I love this talk. This is awesome. I came into IT at a very young age. I kind of started working as soon as I graduated high school, and then I kind of moved around. And college was kind of one of those things that I had done on the side and prioritized the career. So when you made this framework and you kind of looked at everything, you're like, what do we need? How do we identify these gaps? This is awesome. My question is, how do we take this to HR? Because I'm noticing there is a bit of a gap in some ways where we still have to get these certain checkbox requirements, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned you want to bring in like attorneys, and like I've talked to so many IT people. I met a guy that has an English degree. I know people with like a culinary arts degree. Like they're in
Oh,
IT, like,
can you teach me that? I'm terrible at cooking.
so it's like we're getting to this point where people acknowledge in IT that the
Yeah.
degree is just a checkbox. We get this. Like we're getting there for the most part. There are some skill sets that you'll learn. You'll build networks with your alumni there. How do we say we need to take this framework and prioritize these things to the next level? Like,
Yeah.
you've got the first piece of this. How do we take it up there?
Yeah, that is a tough one. It's probably the hardest part of the entire thing, because it depends on the organization, the leadership of the security teams, to say we have to go and bring this as a problem because we can't solve this talent problem anymore without bringing HR in. That's where I'm seeing it become somewhat successful. But man, it's going to be a hard road. It's going to be a long and hard road. I don't think I have a good way to say it's not. But I'd like it to be an easier road. All right, I'm getting the cane on the side. But thank you so much. I'll stick around. Appreciate it. Enjoy your cocktails. And have a good afternoon.